Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples chosen by Jesus, is infamous for betraying his master with a kiss, leading to the arrest and crucifixion of Christ. By pointing to Jesus after the supper with the authorities, Judas set into motion the series of events that became the foundations of the Christian faith: Jesus' arrest, his trial, his death by crucifixion, and eventually his resurrection, known collectively as the Passion of Christ. I regularly share useful and meaningful Bible videos. This act of treachery has puzzled scholars and believers for centuries, raising the question, why did Judas betray Jesus? Was it greed that drove him, or was there something more profound at play? The Gospels provide different perspectives, hinting at motives ranging from financial gain to satanic influence, each adding layers of complexity to Judas's character and his ultimate decision. As we explore the reasons behind Judas's betrayal, we delve into the depths of human nature, spiritual conflict, and the tragic consequences of his fateful choice. If you like these videos, please press the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share them with your friends and family. The Bible story of Judas betraying Jesus is found in all 4 Gospels. Due to his notorious role in all the Gospel narratives, Judas remains a controversial figure in Christian history. His betrayal is seen as setting in motion the events that led to Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, which, according to traditional Christian theology, brought salvation to humanity. Though the Bible offers few details about Judas's background, all 4 canonical Gospels of the New Testament name him among Jesus' 12 closest disciples or apostles. He was first mentioned in Matthew 10:1. But unlike his other apostles, most of whom were loyal to God and chose martyrdom, Judas Iscariot had a reputation for being the most notorious traitor to God. During the meal of the Last Supper, Jesus predicts that one of you will betray me, referring to Judas. Judas leaves the supper and goes to the Roman authorities who are looking to arrest Jesus. He accepts a bribe of 30 silver and agrees to take them to Jesus. Judas knew that Jesus and the disciples would go to a garden near Jerusalem and lead the soldiers there, stating, "Whoever it is I kiss, he is the one. Take him into custody and lead him away under guard." Leading the group into the garden, Judas sees Jesus with his disciples and approaches him. "Greetings, Rabbi," Judas says, and he kisses Jesus very lightly. "Fellow, for what purpose are you present?" Jesus responds. Matthew 26:49-50, Jesus answers his question, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" As the soldiers move toward Jesus, the apostles recognize what is happening. "Lord, should we strike with the sword?" they ask. Luke 22:49, before Jesus can respond, Peter uses one of the 2 swords that the apostles have and attacks Malchus, a servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. Jesus caresses the ear of Malchus, healing the wound. He then teaches an important lesson, telling Peter, "Return your sword to its place. For all those who take up the sword will perish by the sword." Jesus is willing to be captured, for he explains how would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must take place this way. Matthew 26:52. This then leads to the trial and crucifixion of Christ. After Jesus was arrested, what happened to Judas was tragic. The Gospel of Matthew says that Judas, after learning that Jesus was about to be tried, felt deeply guilty and remorseful for his actions. He returned to the priests all 30 pieces of silver to the priest, then left and took his own life. Saint. Luke tells us that Judas did not end his own life, but that he bought a piece of land with the money that Judas had when he betrayed God. Judas had an accident in that field and died. In Dante Alighieri's divine song, Judas is punished forever in the 9th hell there. He is devoured by Lucifer, along with Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, the leaders of the senatorial group that assassinated Julius Caesar. The deepest area of the 9th layer of hell is for traitors to their masters and benefactors and is named Judeca, after Judas. Judas had his head stuffed between Satan's 3 mouths, condemned to be devoured forever by the devil. At every mouth he with his teeth was crunching, a sinner, in the manner of a brake, so that he 3 of them tormented thus. To him in front, the biting was as naught unto the clawing, for sometimes the spine, utterly stripped of all the skin that remained. That soul up there which has the greatest pain, the master said, is Judas Iscariot. With head inside, he plies his legs without. Dante Alighieri, The Divine Comedy Inferno, Canto 34. We can see that Judas suffered a tragic end, commensurate with his betrayal of Jesus. Why did Judas betray Jesus? The Bible doesn't go into detail about why Judas betrayed Jesus. The Gospels do not give us any individual scenes of Judas and Jesus, except for the scene involving the supper. It is therefore difficult for us to know exactly why Judas, one of the 12 closest apostles of the Lord, betrayed him for only 30 pieces of silver. The Gospel of Mark gives no motive for Judas's betrayal but does present Jesus predicting it at the Last Supper, an event also described in all the other Gospels. The Gospel of Matthew 26:15 states that Judas committed the betrayal in exchange for 30 pieces of silver. The Gospel of Luke 22:3 and the Gospel of John 13:27 suggest that Satan possessed him. But would Judas dare to betray Jesus, a teacher, to Judas at a very cheap price of only 30 pieces of silver? The 30 pieces of silver were too little compared to the importance of Jesus at that time, when the most powerful priests were always hungry for a chance to remove Jesus. Judas Iscariot is a wise treasurer and always pays attention to all that can benefit him. So why did he decide to hand Jesus over with such a small amount of money? Judas' motive for the crime remains a mystery to this day, because the Gospels, when recounting this event, write about Judas' motive in various forms. Even in Judas's Gospel, a non-canonical Gnostic Gospel, the motive for Judas's entire actions is not at all motivated by his greed or Satan like the mainstream Gospels. Matthew 26:14-16 and John 12:6 designate Judas's motive as avarice, but Luke 22:3-6 ascribes his action to the entrance of Satan into his body, paralleling John 13:27, where after Judas took the bread at the Last Supper, Satan entered into him. Jesus then says, "What you are going to do quickly." This is the culmination of John 6:70-71, which after Jesus says, "Did I not choose you, the 12, and one of you is a devil," discloses that he meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, for he, one of the 12, was to betray him. There are many theories about Judas' motives put forward, such as Judas was motivated by greed, Judas is possessed by demons, Judas had to fulfill a prophecy, Judas' betrayal was a necessary part of the Lord's plan of salvation, Judas is politically motivated, Judas was frustrated and angry. The idea that Judas Iscariot was motivated by greed is one of the most commonly cited reasons for his betrayal of Jesus. This explanation is primarily based on passages from the Gospels that highlight Judas's relationship with money and his willingness to betray his teacher for a financial reward. In the Gospel of Matthew, the narrative describes Judas proactively seeking out the chief priests to offer his services in betraying Jesus. He asks them directly, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" Matthew 26:15. The chief priests then counted out for him 30 pieces of silver, which Judas accepted as payment for his betrayal. This sum, while not insignificant, was a relatively modest amount, roughly equivalent to the price of a slave in the Old Testament, Exodus 21:32. The fact that Judas was willing to betray Jesus, whom he had followed closely for years, for this amount suggests that his desire for money had a powerful influence over his decisions. Judas's role as the keeper of the money bag among Jesus' disciples further supports the idea that he had a particular interest in money. The Gospel of John provides additional insight into Judas's character, describing an incident where Judas criticized Mary for anointing Jesus' feet with expensive perfume. Judas argued that the perfume should have been sold and the money given to the poor, but John adds a critical detail. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it, John 12:6. This passage paints Judas as someone who not only managed the disciples' finances but also took advantage of his position for personal gain. His greed and willingness to steal from the group's funds further illustrate his moral character and susceptibility to temptation. The act of betraying Jesus for 30 pieces of silver can be seen as the culmination of Judas's greed. Despite witnessing Jesus' miracles and teachings firsthand, Judas ultimately chose material wealth over loyalty to his teacher. His decision to betray Jesus for money stands in stark contrast to the teachings of Jesus, who often warned against the dangers of wealth and greed. For example, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus taught, "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money," Matthew 6:24. Judas's betrayal exemplifies this conflict, as he decided to serve money over his devotion to Jesus, leading to one of the most infamous acts of treachery in history. The details about Judas Iscariot that we know in the Bible are mostly related to money. In the list of the first 12 apostles of God, Judas Iscariot always ranks last, and he keeps their treasurer. John 12:6 introduces Judas's thievery by saying, "As he had the money box, He used to take what was put into it. One of the clearest details in the Bible that proves Judas' greed is reported in the Gospel of John, when he rebuked Mary for pouring perfume on Jesus. The writer says that Judas was only upset because had Mary sold the perfume for the group, he would have accessed the proceeds and taken some for himself, John 12:6. Jesus told Judas to leave Mary alone. And after that incident, Judas met with the religious leaders and accepted money to betray Jesus. This scene indicates that Judas was benefiting financially from being around Jesus, and may have been concerned that Jesus knew about his theft. Another significant factor in Judas's betrayal of Jesus, as depicted in the Gospels, is the influence of Satan. The Bible suggests that Judas's actions were not solely the result of his own choices, but were also driven by a darker spiritual force. This idea is particularly emphasized in the Gospels of Luke and John. In Luke's account, the role of Satan in Judas's betrayal is explicitly mentioned just before Judas decides to approach the chief priests. The passage reads, "Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. And Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus." Luke 22:3-4. This statement indicates that Judas's betrayal was not merely a human act, but was influenced by Satan, who entered into him and spurred him to act against Jesus. The timing of this influence immediately before Judas sought out the religious leaders suggests that Satan's entry into Judas was a decisive moment in his choice to betray Jesus. The Gospel of John also highlights Satan's role in Judas's actions, particularly during the Last Supper. After Jesus reveals that one of his disciples will betray him, Judas is identified as the betrayer when Jesus gives him a piece of bread. John then notes, as soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. So Jesus told him, "What you are about to do quickly." John 13:27. This verse underscores the idea that Judas's betrayal was heavily influenced, if not directly caused, by Satan. The phrase "Satan entered into him" proposes a form of possession or control, where Judas's actions were no longer entirely his own, but were driven by a malevolent force. The involvement of Satan in Judas's betrayal can be seen as part of the broader cosmic struggle between good and evil, a theme that runs throughout the New Testament. Jesus himself acknowledges the presence of evil forces at work, particularly in the context of his impending crucifixion. In John 14:30, Jesus refers to Satan as the prince of this world, acknowledging that Satan has a certain level of influence and power in the world, even as God's ultimate plan unfolds. Judas's susceptibility to Satan's influence raises questions about free will and responsibility. While Satan's role suggests that Judas was, to some extent, a pawn in a larger spiritual battle, the Gospels do not absolve Judas of responsibility for his actions. His willingness to entertain thoughts of betrayal, his greed, and his failure to resist Satan's temptations all contribute to his final act of treachery. The notion of Satan entering into Judas also adds a tragic dimension to his character. It portrays Judas not just as a greedy or disillusioned disciple, but as someone who fell prey to the powers of darkness, leading to his ultimate downfall. This aspect of the story serves as a warning about the dangers of allowing one's heart to be swayed by evil influences and the importance of spiritual vigilance. In addition to these two common motives, several other theories have been put forward to explain Judas' betrayal. According to the Gospel of John, although Judas was described as a greedy and wicked man before he betrayed Jesus, he chose him to fulfill the prophecy John 13:18, which comes from Psalm 41, "Even my bosom friend, in whom I trusted, who ate of my bread, has lifted the heel against me." Jesus also reiterated this in John 17:12, when he said that one of those who were with him would be lost for the words of the Bible to be fulfilled. Similar points are found in other Gospels. While some argue that this explains Judas' betrayal, others argue that God gives people free will and the right to choose their actions, so Judas may not have chosen to do so. Some authors argue that Judas did not betray Jesus because of his greed, but because of an extremely strong political motive. Judas decided to give up everything to follow Jesus because he thought that Jesus was indeed the Messiah who could liberate the Jews from Roman domination, Acts 1:6. But Jesus did not take any concrete action or plan to liberate the Jews from Roman rule. Jesus didn't just want to liberate the Romans. His goal was to free all of humanity from sin. When it became clear that Jesus wasn't doing the things that a political champion would do coming into Jerusalem on a war horse, destroying Romans, Judas may have reconsidered who he was getting behind. When Judas realized that his and Jesus' goals were completely different, he was extremely disappointed and decided to hand Jesus over to the authorities. It is possible that Judas tried to coerce Jesus by revealing him to the authorities so that Jesus would declare himself the political leader of the Jewish people. He would use the support of the people shown during the glorious march into Jerusalem as the foundation for the movement for the liberation of the world. But it is also possible that Judas was frustrated and angry because Jesus did not act to save the Jews as he wished. So Judas decided to betray him as a way to avenge what he saw as Jesus' political betrayal of his nationalists. One scholar has argued that Judas never intended to betray Jesus. Professor William Lassen says that the idea of betrayal is based on a mistranslation, and that Judas intended not to betray Jesus, but to hand over Jesus to the authorities. This can be developed to suggest that Judas intended to bring Jesus and the authorities together to resolve their differences. If Judas didn't intend a betrayal, then that would explain his suicide when he became aware of the catastrophic consequence of his action. This theory was reinforced by Judas' reaction after he learned that Jesus would be executed by crucifixion. It is possible that Judas was merely handing Jesus over to the government in exchange for money, but he did not expect that his actions would end Jesus' life. Or he was manipulated by some spiritual force, specifically because he was possessed by Satan. So Judas was not sufficiently aware and controlled his actions. When Satan's plan succeeds, he leaves Judas' people and slowly reaps the fruits of his crimes. At the same time, Judas was truly awake and free from Satan's control. After Jesus was arrested, Judas Iscariot experienced a profound change of heart. The Gospels tell us that the weight of his actions quickly began to torment him. In Matthew 27:3-5 we read, "When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders." Judas's sudden realization of the gravity of his betrayal led him to confront the very people with whom he had conspired. His return to the religious leaders, clutching the silver coins he had once eagerly accepted, highlights his deep remorse. Judas confessed his guilt to the chief priests and elders, saying, "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood," Matthew 27:4. This admission of guilt indicates that Judas did not foresee the full consequences of his actions. He may have been disillusioned by Jesus or frustrated by the unfolding events, but the reality of his betrayal hit him with devastating clarity once Jesus was condemned to die. However, the religious leaders coldly dismissed his plea, replying, "What is that to us? That's your responsibility." Matthew 27:4. Their indifference to his remorse further isolated Judas, leaving him alone with his overwhelming guilt. The despair Judas felt led him to a tragic end. The Bible states, "So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself," Matthew 27:5. Unable to bear the weight of his betrayal and the realization that his actions had set in motion the events leading to Jesus' crucifixion, Judas took his own life. His suicide is one of the most tragic moments in the Gospels, underscoring the destructive power of guilt and regret. Judas' reaction after Jesus' arrest is a powerful portrayal of remorse and despair. His return of the silver coins to the temple shows that the material benefit was no longer worth anything to him when he understood his great betrayal. The act of throwing money at the temple may symbolize his refusal to take bribes, but it also reflects his inability to repair the damage he has caused. Judas' rejection of remorse by religious leaders underscores the loneliness and helplessness he felt. They were complicit in the arrest of Jesus but refused to admit any responsibility for the outcome. Their cold reaction to Judas' confession further deepened his sense of isolation, leading to despair. Judas' suicide was the tragic end of his great sin. It represents a complete loss of hope and a failure to seek forgiveness. While Peter, who also denied Jesus, found redemption, Judas was destroyed by his sins and could not see any path to reconciliation. Finally, I will mention a very remarkable hypothesis recorded in an ancient gospel from the 2nd century and published in 2006. That is the Gospel of Judas, and the author of this gospel is Judas Iscariot. This is an unorthodox gospel, so we cannot find it anywhere in the Bible. The content of this gospel recounts the conversations between Jesus and Judas Iscariot. The book reveals that Judas' betrayal of God was due to his following the instructions Jesus gave him. This is in stark contrast to other Orthodox Gospels, which portrayed Judas as a traitor who handed Jesus over to the authorities in exchange for 30 pieces of silver. The Gospel of Judas does not defame Jesus, but it is not included in the Orthodox Bible because it is believed to be contrary to the teachings of the early church. It is believed to be related to the Gnostics, a mostly Christian group condemned as heretical by the early church leaders because of their unorthodox spiritual beliefs. According to the text, Judas was the only one of Jesus' disciples who understood his teacher's words exactly. Early comments on the manuscript suggested that it portrayed Judas in largely positive, even heroic, terms. The manuscript was said to show that Jesus asked Judas to betray him so that Jesus could be freed from his physical body and the plan of salvation could be fulfilled. Judas was instructed to sacrifice Jesus, the man. You will sacrifice the man that clothes me, and was warned by Jesus that he, Judas, would be hated by future generations as a result. However, the Gospel of Judas was written at least a century after the death of Jesus and Judas, which means that it provides very little reliable historical information about their lives. It certainly does not provide enough evidence for Judas Iscariot's true motives. While we cannot be certain why Judas betrayed Jesus, some things are certain. First, although Judas was chosen to be one of the 12, John 6:64, all scriptural evidence points to the fact that he never believed Jesus to be God. He even may not have been convinced that Jesus was the Messiah as Judas understood it. Unlike the other disciples who called Jesus Lord, Judas never used this title for Jesus and instead called him Rabbi, which acknowledged Jesus as nothing more than a teacher. While other disciples at times made great professions of faith and loyalty, John 6:68, 11:16, Judas never did so and appears to have remained silent. This lack of faith in Jesus is the foundation for all other considerations listed below. The same holds for us. If we fail to recognize Jesus as God incarnate, and therefore the only one who can provide forgiveness for our sins and the eternal salvation that comes with it, we will be subject to numerous other problems that stem from a wrong view of God. Second, Judas not only lacked faith in Christ, but he also had little or no personal relationship with Jesus. When the Synoptic Gospels list the 12, they are always listed in the same general order with slight variations: Matthew 10:2-4, Mark 3:16-19, Luke 6:14-16. The general order is believed to indicate the relative closeness of their relationship with Jesus. Despite the variations, Peter and the brothers James and John are always listed first, which is consistent with their relationships with Jesus. Judas is always listed last, which may indicate his relative lack of a personal relationship with Christ. Additionally, the only documented dialogue between Jesus and Judas involves Judas being rebuked by Jesus after his greed-motivated remark to Mary, John 12:1-8, Judas' denial of his betrayal, Matthew 26:25, and the betrayal itself, Luke 22:48. Third, Judas was consumed with greed to the point of betraying the trust of not only Jesus but also his fellow disciples, as we see in John 12:5-6. Judas may have desired to follow Jesus simply because he saw the great following and believed he could profit from collections taken for the group. The fact that Judas was in charge of the money bag for the group would indicate his interest in money, John 13:29. Additionally, Judas, like most people at the time, believed the Messiah was going to overthrow Roman occupation and take a position of power ruling over the nation of Israel. Judas may have followed Jesus hoping to benefit from association with him as the new reigning political power. No doubt he expected to be among the ruling elite after the revolution. By the time of Judas' betrayal, Jesus had made it clear that he planned to die, not start a rebellion against Rome. So Judas may have assumed, just as the Pharisees did, that since he would not overthrow the Romans, he must not be the Messiah they were expecting. There are a few Old Testament verses that point to the betrayal, some more specifically than others. Here are two. Even my close friend, whom I trusted, he who shared my bread, has lifted his heel against me, Psalm 41:9. See fulfillment in Matthew 26:14, 48-49. Also I told them, if you think it's best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it. So they paid me 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter. The handsome price at which they priced me, so I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord, to the potter. Zechariah 11:12-13. See Matthew 27:3-5 for the fulfillment of the Zechariah prophecy. These Old Testament prophecies indicate that Judas' betrayal was known to God and that it was sovereignty planned as how Jesus would be killed. But if Judas' betrayal was known to God, did Judas have a choice? And is he held responsible for his part in the betrayal? It is difficult for many to reconcile the concept of free will, as most people understand it with God's foreknowledge of future events. And this is largely due to our limited experience of going through time linearly. If we see God as existing outside of time, since he created everything before time began, we can understand that God sees every moment in time as the present. We experience time linearly. We see time as a straight line, and we pass from one point gradually to another, remembering the past we have already traveled through, but unable to see the future we are approaching. However, God, being the eternal creator of the construct of time, is not in time or on the timeline, but outside of it. It might help to think of a time in relation to God as a circle, with God being the center and therefore equally close to all points. In any case, Judas had the full capacity of making his choice at least up to the point where Satan entered into him, John 13:27, and God's foreknowledge, John 13:10, 18:21, in no way supersedes Judas' ability to make any given choice. Rather, what Judas would choose eventually, God saw as if it was a present observation, and Jesus made it clear that Judas was responsible for his choice and would be held accountable for it. I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me, Mark 14:18. Notice that Jesus characterizes Judas' participation as a betrayal. And regarding accountability for this betrayal, Jesus said, "Woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born," Mark 14:21. Satan, too, had a part in this, as we see in John 13:26-27, and he, too, will be held accountable for his deeds. God in his wisdom was able, as always, to manipulate even Satan's rebellion for the benefit of mankind. Satan helped send Jesus to the cross, and on the cross sin and death were defeated. And now God's provision of salvation is freely available to all who receive Jesus Christ as Savior. On the other hand, without Judas' betrayal, the subsequent crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus would not have happened. So while Judas Iscariot has always been considered the most notorious traitor in the Bible, Judas remains a controversial figure in Christian history. Judas played a necessary, albeit tragic, role in the events leading up to the crucifixion of Jesus, which was the ultimate sacrifice for the sins of mankind. While this did not free Judas from sin, it placed his actions in the broader context of God's plan. In the end, Judas Iscariot's betrayal of Jesus remains one of the most profound mysteries of the New Testament. His actions were influenced by a mix of greed, disillusionment, and satanic manipulation, highlighting the dangers of allowing one's heart to be swayed by material desires and dark forces. Yet Judas's story is also a sobering reminder of the complexities of human nature and the tragic consequences that can arise from giving in to temptation. As we reflect on Judas's betrayal, we are called to examine our own lives. We are called to resist the lures of greed and evil, and to remain steadfast in our faith, lest we too fall into the traps that led to Judas's ultimate downfall.